One of the most important factors in the conversation around police is local politicians. And they don't often talk about police, I'd say, in a context outside of mentioning that the conversation around policing is contentious. And then when they're required to during budget talks and other things around city council. And I just want to go into maybe some of the reasons why I think this is the case. And I think a lot of it centers around the fact that we have inherent weakness in politicians that fundamentally don't really care because it doesn't really lie in their own interest to do so. So their interest, I think, we can see from previous years being rooted in re-election, being rooted in, keeping the status quo, pleasing their peers, and usually I think appealing to constituents and voters, small amount of voters, at least in Edmonton, with narrow concerns around property. So these are their own concerns. And I think, talking about police and policing in the same way that the public is, doesn't necessarily meet any of those self-interested concerns. Doesn't really lead to, I think, any reason to particularly care about this issue or, to really place it at the forefront of any meaningful conversation. And when that's combined with this idea that we usually have of politicians having this blank check once they get elected, and, not necessarily rocking the boat and creating these policies that might change things too much, because then when you go to get reelected, that might, skew your chances. And all of this also, I think, makes it really easy for politicians to be pushed around by powerful institutions. So when you have an institution like the police that sees a situation like we have now, I think it is relatively easy for them to come in and have their way with funding increases. There are also convenient ways to say what you're trying to say without actually saying it. So everyone avoiding the actual sentence, policing by, putting in their platforms this sentence community safety, or these words community safety, as a kind of placeholder for police or policing. And while the umbrella term community safety is great if we're actually talking about, including social agencies, including the public in a really meaningful conversation around what that means for everyone, then that would be a different story. But I think oftentimes it's just a placeholder for, talking about police without talking about police. And another factor is governing by habit. So working with police in, a very close way, I think has been the default for municipal politicians. They obviously work as the enforcement arm of laws that are written by politicians on the provincial, federal, and municipal level. So you just govern by habit. You just go with the status quo. You've been working with your colleagues for a long time. They're integrated in a lot of things like city administration. So there's no reason really to mention them, and it's very easy to ignore these facts when these are your colleagues. And again, it keeps that tacit support because they're protecting the state, they're protecting property, they're protecting law and order that is enshrined by these politicians, and that's upheld and, really put on a pedestal by these politicians. So there is no real reason in a lot of cases to challenge or even mention these institutions like police. And I feel like the idea of controlled opposition is often placed on activists or other people who are put into positions where they seem like they're opposed to positions when in reality they're being controlled or being manipulated to fit within a status quo. But this term also, I think, works really well for politicians who they themselves want to be seen as opposition or, oppositional towards police, or oppositional towards maybe more conservative counselors or politicians. But in reality, they are still controlled by the factors of the status quo, of increasing funding, of continuing to place authority and power into the police's hands. So yeah, thinking of this idea of controlled opposition as another factor of why politicians don't talk about police in these critical ways, or even at all. And I think another way that we can see this too is through issues management. So this idea that issues such as police or any other issue can exist within this political vacuum for politicians and their staffs to then, descend onto and essentially manage. So come up with ideas for how, stakeholders should be engaged. Then you see things like leadership style being brought in, ideas of, bringing everyone to the table. And then, policing becomes this thing where, yeah, you don't even have to mention it. You can if you want to, but it just becomes another issue that you manage. And managing can mean all sorts of things. And I think all those things often fall into the narrow kind of category of, what works best for their own interest, and that interest again falls into re-election, keeping the status quo. And I think ultimately, yeah, seeing that politicians and their partners and colleagues ultimately end up on top. So I think those are definitely some concrete reasons, and kind of paint a larger context around why politicians often dance around this idea of challenging police or even talking about police in a meaningful way. The current council that we have now has been engaged in the conversation around policing by essentially, passing this funding increase that was then, reported and talked about generally as a decrease because the police didn't get as much as they wanted. And I think we saw Mayor Amarjeet Sohi, along with other councillors, being really critical of the structure and the network that police work within. And I guess just kind of asking and saying that they want the public to have a more integrated and connected network of community safety and well-being, so that money can be placed in the right kind of pockets for where it's needed. We saw talks about creating more transparency and more metrics around the way police operate, so that council isn't always in the dark for how to actually evaluate whether or not police are using their resources to the best of their ability, and whether or not their funding is actually tied to performance. There's certainly a lot of buzzwords in this conversation around policing now in 2022. And we're seeing a lot of politicians, I guess, resorting to pretty empty, pretty shallow conversations, I'd say, when it comes to how we're going to move forward with funding police in Edmonton. So I guess I kind of hope that the conversation will evolve in the future. And this is certainly something that we're going to keep our eye on, given that I think there's definitely a public push for further direct action to defund the police. And I think politicians are on notice when it comes to the fact that people are paying attention. So as this conversation evolves, we'll certainly be paying attention and trying to bring you information. And we hope that you come back to the show for this kind of information, but also keep yourself informed on what we think are very crucial and very city-defining topics as we move into the future of this year.